Well, good evening. We're delighted that you're all here. Welcome. I'm Tim Christ, one of the founders of the Newark History Society, which a group of us started about 12 years ago. Most of you know the story, but some of you are here for the first time tonight. We have put on more than 50 programs over the last dozen years now on various topics in Newark history. And let me tell you, the more we do, the more we understand we will never run out of first-rate topics in Newark history. And all the more so as Gail Malmgreen, who's sitting in the fourth row on the left side there, continues with her work on the Newark Archives Project, which the Newark History Society is co-sponsoring with Rutgers Newark, in identifying and providing general descriptions of archival resources in institutions all over New Jersey, and we hope to extend it to New York and beyond. Over 2,000 archives have already been, archival collections have been described so far. To give you some sense of what we do, just since September, when we had a program on the Civil War with John Zinn, and then a program on the American Revolution when Newark was as divided as at any time in its history, followed by the beer industry in Newark, when we made the mistake of not having samples, but it was a good discussion. Then a couple months ago we had our program at NJPAC for the first time in the Chase Room with George Robb, who's here tonight, with a talk about which we call Breaking Barriers, early Newark women in business early in the 20th century. Marvelous program. Tonight we move to the Great Society in Newark. After this, we hope you're on our mailing list. If you aren't, please get one of the cards that was on the food table, or ask me. We want to let you know about a book signing this summer for a date to be determined for Bob Kervin's long-awaited book about 1960s Newark. Then in September, we want you to know, again, date to be determined, Dan O'Flaherty's on the hook for pulling together a program relating to the 100th anniversary of the NAACP in Newark. And then in September, Tom Alrutz, who couldn't make it tonight, is going to do a program on Newark's unknown abolitionist, William Hayes Ward, whose home in the North Ward recently was recognized through the Newark Preservation and Landmarks Committee. There are so many good people here tonight. I just want to recognize Barbara Kukla's here, and she will be very happy to sell you her book on jazz in Newark, number 6 in a series, I think. And we're pleased that Kathleen Gallup, who will similarly be very pleased to tell you about her book on Forest Hill. This topic tonight probably interests people who would also be interested 2 nights from now. Nell Irwin Painter's talk at the Newark Public Library about creating black African Americans, African American history and its meaning, 1619 to the present. Nell Irwin Painter, who's a Newark resident now, is the former president of the American Historical Association and the Edwards Professor of History at Princeton University, Emeritus. A marvelous new member, or 5 or 6 years now, member of the Newark community. So look that out on Wednesday night at the Newark Public Library. Tonight, we are very pleased that Mark Krasovic has put together this program on the Great Society. Mark, as many of you know, is an assistant professor at Rutgers Newark in the History and American Studies departments. He earned his PhD in history at Yale University on this topic, so he is the perfect one to moderate tonight's program. His dissertation is being turned into a book, probably more slowly than you want, but it will eventually be published by University of Chicago Press. He is also the Associate Director of the Institute on Ethnicity, Culture, and the Modern Experience, which is a very important role in this town as well. But most important to us, is that he is on the executive committee of the Newark History Society, and we can call on him to organize programs like this. Mark?
Thank you, and thank you all for coming. As Tim said, I'm actively working on this book, which should be out in a year and a half, 2 years, something like that. And so I've been struggling to come up with something to say tonight that captures all of these stories that I know and that sets up this program appropriately. So that's sort of my job tonight. I'll speak for about 10 minutes to introduce you to the topic, and then very gladly, very happily, very humbly turn things over to our esteemed panelists, who I will introduce in a few minutes. So here's my general background take on the Great Society, and in particular the War on Poverty, and sort of how it came to Newark, and sort of why it matters. So among the jobs of the University of Michigan student body president was to suggest a speaker for the spring's commencement ceremonies. So in the summer of 1963, a Michigan senior wrote to the university president and suggested that John F. Kennedy be invited. His youthful, energetic presidency had galvanized this student body president, many of his classmates, and others of that generation. After Kennedy's assassination in November, the invitation was passed on to Lyndon Johnson, despite intense feelings of skepticism toward the Texan among many Americans, including the student body president and many of his peers. So Johnson, however, was determined to win them all over, right? To assure the nation that he shared the slain president's ideals, and what's more, was possessed of the political skill to make those ideals a legislative reality. The need to distinguish his presidency from the previous ones, to at once fulfill Kennedy's promise and go beyond it, weighed on him heavily. And he said as much one day in April 1964 while skinny dipping in the White House pool with his speechwriter and a close aide. So he asked them to craft a vision of his presidency that would define a new national purpose and outline a plan to aggressively pursue it. The deadline, he explained, was May 22nd, when he would address a crowd of about 85,000 people at the University of Michigan football stadium. So at Ann Arbor, Johnson would sort of relaunch his administration, pulling it out of his predecessor's shadow and hanging it firmly on a phrase to match Teddy Roosevelt's New Nationalism, Wilson's New Freedom, FDR's New Deal, JFK's New Frontier. So the administration committed itself to the Great Society, and the Great Society became the inescapable byword of the administration. So the vision contained therein and offered to Michigan's graduating class, and soon through extensive media coverage to the rest of the nation, was firmly planted in the historic dilemmas of the day. Johnson asked Americans what they would do with their hard-won post-war affluence. Would they place their riches in the service of their higher aspirations, or would they allow unbridled growth and base commercial desires to trample those ambitions to death? The Great Society would result if we chose the first path, the merely rich and powerful society if the second. So in this vision, affluence was widespread but not perfectly distributed. The work of building the Great Society, Johnson suggested that day in Ann Arbor, should begin where the need was greatest, where the dire costs of runaway growth were clearest. It would begin, he said, in the cities. So while he staked the future of his administration on what might become of the cities, he didn't stake it on what his administration could accomplish alone. On the contrary, he acknowledged that while there were numerous federal programs targeting the problems that stood in the way of the Great Society, he said, "I do not pretend that we have the full answer to those problems." But he did promise one thing, quote, "We are going to assemble the best thought and the broadest knowledge from all over the world to find those answers for America." These best minds would generate the experimentation sorely needed in a nation facing the contradictions of post-war prosperity. Because those contradictions were most evident in the cities, the work would start there on what the president called, quote, "the frontier of imagination and innovation." So, seated behind Johnson, listening to him lay out these plans, the student body president, whose ambitious invitation proposal had ultimately brought Johnson to Ann Arbor, turned to his friend and rolled his eyes. The young man's name was Roger Lowenstein, son of Alan Lowenstein, himself a Wolverine of one of Newark's greatest sort of mid-century liberal activists. Lowenstein had played, that's Lowenstein pair, Alan Lowenstein, had played a pivotal role in the city's mid-century charter reform movement, by which the city's current mayor-council system was created, by which the city was divided into its current wards, and by which the mixed ward-based and at-large system of city council elections was established. Alan Lowenstein had chaired the Charter Commission. So in later he wrote about how one part of the argument for such reform was greater black representation in city government. Black migration to Newark, as became abundantly clear by the end of the 1950s when the Mayor's Commission on Group Relations issued its crucial Newark, a City in Transition report, had placed the city on the road to a black majority, yet City Hall remained lily white. And indeed, if you read some of the testimony given at these Charter Commission hearings, you'll find people making very explicitly this racial argument, in addition to sort of the more widespread and better known just good, clean government arguments for charter reform. So, and I tell you this because I think those two things, right, the recent experience that Newark had with administrative reform and the dawning sense of an imminent black majority set the stage for the Great Society's, and in particular the War on Poverty's, arrival in Newark. And I hasten to add that though the Lowenstein connection here is sort of irresistibly cute, all roads, all history does indeed lead back to Newark. The connections between the charter reform movement, and the War on Poverty in Newark are actually in some ways much firmer. And the two best pieces of evidence for this, I think, are Dean Willard Heckel of the Rutgers Law School and local tenant leader, he was head of the Tenants Council at the Hayes Homes, and former Golden Gloves boxing champ Timothy Still. Right? Heckel was the chair of the Newark Citizens Committee on Municipal Government, which was a citizen group that drove charter reform. And Still was a sort of political leader activist in the old Third Ward, whose work was instrumental in making sure that the new Central Ward boundaries would be drawn in such a way that Irvine Turner would be sure to win a council seat and become the first black councilman in the city. So I'll come back to them in a sec, to Willard Heckel and Tim Still. But about 3 months after Michigan's commencement ceremonies, President Johnson signed the Economic Opportunity Act into law. And the centerpiece of that legislation was essentially a grants program. The Community Action Program would provide funding to locally formed anti-poverty agencies that developed and ran their own initiatives with, and this is the quote that's used in the legislation, the maximum feasible participation of area residents. So in Newark, the Community Action Agency was incorporated as an independent entity outside City Hall and outside any existing social service agency. It was called the United Community Corporation, the UCC. And Dean Heckel was the one who came up with a proposal for the local agency, and he became the first president of its board of trustees. Tim Still was an original incorporator of the UCC and vice president, and became president of the board when Heckel retired. So there's direct connections between mid-century charter reform, the War on Poverty. So here's what the UCC sort of looked like. It had its own staff and board of trustees comprised of ever-shifting ratios of regular residents and representatives from the city's business, religious, and government sectors. In addition to the central office, the city was divided into 9 sectors, and the UCC attempted to organize a local neighborhood area board, as they were called, in each. And only the residents of Vailsburg actually voted to reject the creation of an area board in their neighborhood. And I add too that the originator of the idea of these neighborhood area boards, and it was an idea that anti-poverty officials in Washington loved and latched onto and encouraged other cities to adopt. The originator of this idea was Cyril deGrasse Tyson, who was the first executive director of the UCC and the father of famed astrophysicist and public intellectual Neil deGrasse Tyson. So again, everything, he has this new TV show on the cosmos, so everything comes back, even the cosmos itself, to Newark. So you just the more you research this stuff, you just are convinced of that. So each area board would design anti-poverty programs with the maximum feasible participation of residents, pass their proposal onto the UCC central office on Branford Place, where it would be reviewed and hopefully bundled with whatever proposals were devised at the central office and passed on to Washington, D.C. for funding. Much to the chagrin of Mayor Addonizio and several city councilmen in particular, the money bypassed City Hall and went right to the UCC. So, the UCC and community action in general then were grand administrative experiments, existing in this sort of liminal in-between space between existing layers of government. And given the mandate to involve as many residents as possible in the design and implementation of anti-poverty programs, the UCC would soon become embroiled in the city's increasingly tense racial politics. In fact, people at the time argued this, and I think there's a good case to be made for this, that the UCC became a sort of independent political base in the city. A well-funded, independent training ground for local black politics, not the only one, of course, but I think an important one. A space in which local residents had a hand in shaping programs that would affect their own lives, where alternative interpretations of political life in Newark, from various elections, the medical school relocation crisis, the civil disorders of 1967, where alternative interpretations of those things were developed and voiced, and which quickly became a target of the Addonizio administration, the city police department, and conservative forces in Congress, especially in Washington, D.C. So I think ultimately, though he couldn't have known it at the time, that Roger Lowenstein's skepticism was maybe a bit misplaced. For it would be in his hometown that the Great Society would be pulled to that frontier of imagination and innovation that Johnson invoked, where any skepticism of Johnson himself must yield to an appreciation of the people who made the Great Society a reality on the ground in Newark. They were the best minds that Johnson needed, even if he didn't realize it at the time. And among them were people whose names will be familiar to many of you, even if I leave inevitably many of them out. So Willard Heckel, Tim Still, Willie Wright, George Richardson, Hilda Hidalgo, Marion Kidd, Tom Hayden, Bessie Smith, Jesse Allen, Dickinson Debevoise, Phil Hutchings, Sharp James, Donald Tucker, Ramon Enesis, and of course, Ken Gibson, Becky Andrade, and Oliver Lofton. So with that sort of setup, I'll introduce and turn it over to them. And I've asked each of them to speak for about 10 minutes on sort of whatever strikes their fancy that's topical, on their memories of the anti-poverty program, how they became involved, how they judge its value, its legacy. I brought my notebook, so I will be taking good notes. So first, Mr. Ken Gibson. What do you say about Ken Gibson? To be honest, I've never been totally clear on how exactly he got involved with the UCC, so hence the notebook. I hope to learn something about that tonight. But I do know, of course, that he was, of course, a city engineer and one of the UCC's earliest vice presidents and members of its board of trustees. And I think after that, he just kind of disappeared from Newark politics, right? Of course, he made historic runs for mayor in 1966 and 1977. And in 1977, he ran on a community choice ticket with, I believe it was 8 candidates, 7 of whom had worked or served in some capacity for the anti-poverty program in Newark. And so next, seated in the middle, is Becky Doggett, Becky Andrade, formerly, whose involvement in Newark, like Mr. Gibson, like Mr. Lofton, goes back at least 50 years when she joined the Newark Corps picket line at the Barringer High School construction site in 1963. And after that, she became actively involved in the civil rights movement in Newark, which focused primarily on jobs and economic justice. What brings her here tonight most directly was that she was the founding president of the Newark Preschool Council, which was a delegate agency of the UCC, and what they called Head Start was one of the national emphasis programs launched by the War on Poverty. So the Newark Preschool Council was the citywide Head Start organization which just celebrated its 50th anniversary this year. And I don't know where my paper went. There it is. And Mr. Oliver Lofton, long-time prominent attorney in the area. In the early 60s was a special assistant to Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy, later Assistant U.S. District Attorney for New Jersey, and even after that, Assistant Essex County Prosecutor. Again, what brings him here tonight most directly was that he was the first director of the Newark Legal Services Project. Like Head Start, was a delegate agency of the UCC and one of those national emphasis programs. And I'll add that during the civil disorders of 1967, Mr. Lofton was Governor Richard J. Hughes's liaison with the Newark community, and he was later appointed by the governor to serve on his Select Commission on Civil Disorder, which of course produced one of the most sort of thoughtful, hard-hitting of the 60s riot reports, right, titled A Report for Action in Spring of 1968. So that is our wonderful panelists who I'm honored to introduce. Please welcome them. And with that, we'll sort of go in order as they are seated. So we will start with Mayor Gibson, please. You can stay seated if you prefer. You like to come up?
He's a politician.
I'm going to get even with you, Becky. I want to correct, if you're keeping your notes correctly, I ran for mayor in 1966. Came in third out of a bunch of folks, and we had the community choice ticket that came out of a convention that we held in Clinton Place Junior High School in 1969, and I was elected mayor in 1970. You had 2 years. I just want to give you the right dates because we want to keep history correct. I was trying to decide what I was going to say to you folks in 10 minutes, and I decided that I couldn't say everything that I wanted to. Just wanted to highlight a couple of things that are important, I think. I used a phrase during my administration and during my campaigns that said that wherever American cities are going, Newark will get there first. And you outlined some of the things that we were first in. I'm going to give you a couple of more that I think should be good to remember in a group as large as this. UCC was the successor to community action that was already taking place in Newark that was called the Business and Industrial Coordinating Council. That was a forerunner of community action in Newark and also the forerunner of community action, I think, in this country. When Dean Henkel became chairman of the board of UCC, those of us who were community activists ended up participating one way or another, either as vice president, staff, or people who were submitting applications for funding. UCC became a model, in my opinion, of what community action should have been and was after we set the stage. If you think about the legacy of those programs, and you mentioned some of them. You mentioned the Newark Legal Services Program, Oliver ran, Newark Preschool Council. There are still some of them still existing. La Casa de Don Pedro still exists as far as I know. And there are legacies beyond that. You talked about the development of political activity. You named some of the people. But without the community action that was developed based on the influence of BICC, UCC, and more importantly, the civil rights activities in the city of Newark. Most people don't know it, but after I was elected, it was expected that the business community, on their thought process, didn't have to be involved anymore. Everything was going to be handled by the mayor. Bob Kervin's here. Walter Chambers is here. They'll tell you that we used to have dinners at the Rob Treat Hotel down the street that would have 500 people at annual dinners for the Urban League, for the NAACP. Sally Caller's here. NAACP would have 500 people at a dinner. The Urban League, Newark Essex Corps, which Bob ran, set the stage for the changes in employment in this city. I think Bob had more pickets going than anybody. Newark Essex Corps would picket seniors. People don't realize what had to take place in order for the achievements to take place in the city. Most people don't realize that White Castle didn't hire black people to serve hamburgers. I say that to young people today, they don't believe me. You couldn't get a job as a teller in a bank in Newark. You couldn't drive the bus. Forget about being the police. The changes that took place in the city of Newark took place because of community action. That community action, the UCC was a part of, but it followed BICC, and BICC followed the civil rights organizations. Essex County Urban League was a job finding agency. BICC was put together. We had a jobs available committee and a people available committee. I was chairman of one of those committees. That's how I ended up being vice president of UCC. Becky was involved many years before that. I remember we took a trip to Washington. I had to ride in Becky's Volkswagen van. We went down for one of our civil rights operations. People have no idea what had to take place in order for improvements to take place. And don't mention education. The quality of education when I arrived in Newark in 1940 was one of the best public school systems in the country. It's a disaster now, I think. And when I came out of that little black schoolhouse in Alabama and got to the third grade in Newark, I was at least 1 year academically ahead of every child in the third grade in Newark. And we had one of the best public school systems in the country. Most people talk about what has happened. Everybody wants to point fingers at somebody or some group. But I still don't think that it makes any sense to give our young people high school certificates if they can't read. That's my personal feeling. And I call it, we should be involved in what I call enlightened self-interest. How would you like to have your doctor write a prescription for you and you get the wrong medicine? We are producing rejects, and it's a disgrace in the richest country in the world. And Mark stole some of my items when he talked about Cyril Tyson, because I wanted to tell you that if it had not been for Cyril Tyson and Dr. Kenneth Clark and Hall UAC production, UCC would never have gotten off the ground. So we have a lot of legacy in the city of Newark. I think we made history in the city of Newark, but that history was not personal history. It was for the benefit of people. I'm close to 10 minutes, I think, or past it.
Probably about that.
So Mark, I just wanted to correct that 1 year, don't forget.
I misspoke, thank you.
You stole about 5 years from me. Thank you all, and I'll be around.
Thank you, Mayor Ken. So every now and then they pull us out of the archives and they want us to tell you about those days. But it's always good because it's important to remember this history, and hopefully it has some lessons learned that can keep us going forward in today's struggles. One of the most important things I thought I wanted to comment on and talk about was oftentimes you hear conversations now and comments now about the fact that the war on poverty and the Great Society was not successful. It did not accomplish anything. But we know, certainly here in Newark, and I'm sure there are many other cities around the country, that the Great Society did make a difference to hundreds and thousands of people. So I just wanted to kind of highlight some of the things that I felt happened here in Newark that have made a difference. One of the most important things, I think, is that the Kennedy-Johnson Declaration of War on Poverty was a direct result of the Civil Rights Movement. There would not have been a war on poverty if there had not been a civil rights movement. And many of us who were involved in the civil rights movement just moved smoothly into the war on poverty because we knew that this was an opportunity for us to continue to make change with some resources to make the changes that we knew were supposed to happen in our society, and especially here in Newark. The whole question of making steps towards fighting for legal justice, and this was also, the war on poverty was one of the first responses of our country to responding to the needs of poor people. Before that, there was no real acknowledgement that poor people existed or that the government had any responsibility to change their lives. So the war on poverty was really an acknowledgement on our national government that something needed to be done. And what was important about that response also was that it did talk about maximum feasible participation of the poor, as we managed to struggle to say in those days. And this response was revolutionary because it encouraged the formation of the coalition. Ken and Mark spoke about this coalition that kind of crystallized into what became United Community Corporation. But that was a very interesting coalition. Civil rights activists, grassroots leaders, clergy who were very active, and the law community, the legal community, Rutgers Law School, and other lawyers who came forward to lend a hand, all as one organization. And what they did was phenomenal. One, just forming that kind of organization in Newark was notable. And then they've maneuvered and managed to bypass City Hall. You can imagine Adonisio and Malafronte and the guys and the council members in City Hall were incensed. And it wasn't just in Newark, it was around the country. We had repercussions about that later, as you well know. But the fact that they pulled this off, formed this corporation, got the federal government to approve these dollars, millions of dollars, to come into Newark outside of the City Hall structure. The other thing that we also have heard a little bit through Mark was the idea of organizing these area boards, which was supposed to be the vehicle for poor people to not only get organized, but to have a say in how these funds were going to be spent to make changes in their communities. And the third phenomenal thing they did was they hired this, what I call visionary wheeler dealer, Cyril Tyson, Cyril DeGrasse Tyson. He was really coming from Harlem, with his sharp clothes and his cigar and talking and getting folks in Newark to do things that they never thought they could do. He was quite a guy, and it's true that if we had not had Cyril Tyson come, we probably would not have accomplished even half of what we did accomplish. The other thing that I thought was important was how UCC and the anti-poverty program did mobilize people. And if any of you have started reading Junius Williams' recent book, Unfinished Agenda, Junius gives some really great descriptions of this young man, first active in the South in SNCC. Then he came into Newark with Tom Hayden and Students for Democratic Society. So they were kind of the radical left young folks organizing in the South Ward. But how joining and making the struggles through United Community Corporation really helped frame his training and his understanding of how things got done in Newark. And Junius is still working at it, over 50 years later. But out of this whole effort, there were several things that I think were very important that happened. The United Community Corporation now is just a tiny shadow of itself in this day and age. But when it was really the major agency for receiving the anti-poverty funds, it really did make a lot of things happen. Through Junius's work, the whole medical school fight would not have happened because he would not have understood what he needed to understand to make that combination of political struggle and legal struggle to take on the state of New Jersey, the governor, and the whole issue around the medical school. And I told Junius, I said, Junius, you were doing community benefit agreements before we even had a name for it. Because that's really what that group did up there. They did one of the most effective community benefit agreements that said, okay, you can have your medical school. It's not going to be as big as you wanted, but you'll have it. But you also have to give some very significant, important benefits to our community. And that's had a long-lasting legacy here in Newark. And the key thing, in addition, looking at the economic justice areas that UCC really started or helped to foment, Ken mentioned CORE and Bob Curvin. My first effort in Newark was on the picket line at Barringer High School with Newark Essex CORE. And then we moved to the Rutgers Law School. So by the time of 1967, when the medical school fight really got started, Junius and Gus Henningberg, and the folks really understood what needed to happen to make sure that there was economic justice, to make sure that African American people, especially the men, could work on that construction site. And because of that fight, eventually those men actually got into the union construction trades. We started a few years earlier trying to get them on the site at Barringer, but it was really the medical school and that fight that really got hundreds of African American men into the union construction trades. And in 2001, I kind of did another generation of that work when I was working with the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice, one of Alan Lowenstein's organizations, by the way, that he helped, that he formed, that he funded and formed. So things do keep going around in cycles and circles. Now, in the education reform area, where I spent most of my work and my effort, the Newark Preschool Council became or was one of the first and one of the largest community-controlled Head Start programs. Head Start had millions of dollars that it released around the country. But one of the most significant things was that here in Newark, United Community Corporation understood that education was important. And so UCC allocated most of the dollars that were coming into Newark to early childhood education through Head Start. The bulk of the money that Newark got went into Newark Preschool Council. And what was so significant, not only that Newark set aside most of its money for early childhood education, but they also understood that the organization, Newark Preschool Council, was important as a community-controlled organization. They wanted an organization that was going to have a large percentage of the governance by parents who were going to have children in the program. So because of Cyril Tyson and the way that Cyril could maneuver, he was able to keep the big guys from trying to take the program. You had the Newark Board of Education who felt that they were entitled to run the program. You had the Catholic Diocese of Newark that felt they should run the program. You had the Protestant Community Social Services agencies that felt that they should get the Head Start money and run the program. And much to their chagrin, UCC, and with Cyril leading the maneuvering, what gave this huge amount of money, over $2 million, which was a lot of money in 1964, to this new, untested organization of community folk. And that is how we were able to get started. We who formed Newark Preschool Council understood that we needed to do two main things. One, we wanted to make sure that the children had the best possible comprehensive educational, health, social services that we could give so that they in fact could get that Head Start that Johnson was talking about. But just as important to us, because we were civil rights activists, was that we knew that we needed a training base to help parents organize so that when their kids moved on to the public school, these parents understood what education was about, and they had had an opportunity to begin to organize themselves so that they could take on fights that we knew they would have to take on with the public schools to begin to turn the public school system around. So we who formed Newark Preschool Council saw that it was not just about early childhood, but more importantly it was about what this program, the impact this program could have on the whole family, and not only on the whole family, but the community as a whole. As someone mentioned, Newark Preschool celebrated its 50th anniversary this year. It still does a significant job with working with children and providing services. I don't think that the whole area of organizing parents to deal with the public school system has kept up the way I would hope it has. But I think when we look at the hundreds and hundreds, thousands really, of children who got that Head Start, who got health care, who got educational services, who really did get a Head Start because they were involved. And then the hundreds of young mothers who learned about education, who went back to school, got high school diplomas, college degrees, became teachers, became very much knowledgeable about education because they got exposed to Head Start in their young life. These are the things that I think we have to remember about what our civil rights struggle produced, what the Great Society has produced. And these are some of the legacies that I know that Newark has stood out in the forefront over the years. And I hope it's going to be the kinds of things that will keep Newark moving forward in the future.
I realize I should have probably just introduced people individually than all at once. But now, Mr. Oliver Lofton. Thank you.
I am somewhat motivated to begin where I think I began in terms of my commitment to the civil rights struggle. And it goes back to, as best I can remember, so when I was in the 6th grade and we were on a 8-4 program in Neptune, New Jersey. And they had in my Ridge Avenue school a south side of the school and a north side of the school. It was an integrated school, but it was a segregated school at the same time. South side of the school was principally all white, in fact all white. The north side of the school was all black. And I had a 6th grade teacher, a West Indian lady who was about 4 foot tall. And her name was Farilla McKinnon. And Miss McKinnon, to make a long story short, I was a fairly standout student. In fact, I played Santa Claus, and because I played Santa Claus in that for the whole school because I was the only one who could recite and understand the operetta program for Christmas. Me, my size. But in any event, yeah, how about it, Bob? I had a certain amount of influence with the other kids and that kind of stuff and so on. And she decided she was going to form this Negro History Club. And I had never heard of a Negro History Club. I'm playing ball and all this kind of thing and doing what I do after school and whistling at the little girls and all that kind of thing and so forth. And she says, I want you to join this Negro History Club. I said, I don't want to join a Negro History Club. What are you talking about? But at that time, there was a time when teachers used to go to your home. And where I lived, they had a kind of long walkway coming up. It was on a Saturday. And it was toward the end of the school year. It was warm. Windows were open on the front porch and that kind of thing. I'm on the inside. My father, he was outside swinging on the swing. My father was the kind of man, to make a long story short with him, is that, as the old folks used to say, he didn't take any tea for the fever. Okay. So I see Miss McKinnon coming down the walkway. I said, oh, Lord, what is going to happen now? So I'm inside, and she comes up on the porch, and she tells my father, said, I spoke to Oliver about joining the Negro History Club. And he was swinging. He said, yeah. He said, and he said he wasn't going to do that and didn't want to do it and so forth and so on. He said, oh yeah, that's what that boy said? And I can tell you, in my whole lifetime, I heard my father call me by my name no more than 4 times. And I had 3 other brothers, 5 sisters, and so on. I'm the last button on Gabriel's shirt. I'm the youngest. And she explained to him what the club was to be about, and this and that, and so forth. And she said, well, it sounds like a pretty good idea to me. So he knew I was inside. He knew I saw what was going on. So he said, boy, come out here. So I said, oh, Lord. So I went out there. He said, he ran down the whole thing. Miss McKinnon said that she asked you to join this Negro History Club, and you said you wasn't going to join. He said, well, I think don't you think you ought to rethink that? He said, and he says, when I think you rethink that, you'll think that's a pretty good idea. I said, how about that? Now, I already knew that if I said no, that it was going to be yes anyhow. So I said yes. He said, yeah, I thought you'd rethink that. That was my introduction to Negro history. And I learned about Edward Du Bois and Denmark Vesey and all of it, and Frederick Douglass and the rest. That's where my inauguration to being involved in the civil rights movement, as I reflect on it, began. And from that, when I went to Howard University Law School, I was fortunate enough to graduate number 1 out of the law school, and I was research assistant to the faculty and other kinds of things, and editor of the Law Journal and the like. And Bob Kennedy was Attorney General at the time. And the Kennedy administration, they had a determination to integrate the Department of Justice. And an edict had been issued, which I found out later, that he had told all of the assistant attorneys general for the various different divisions of the civil rights, of the Department of Justice, to integrate. And he looked around in the Attorney General's office and determined there were no black lawyers in there. So he said, well, find me, in his inimicable fashion, the top black law student to bring into the Attorney General's office. And that happened fortuitously to be me. And I went into his office as the first black in the Attorney General's office of the United States as a lawyer. From there, I migrated to the U.S. Attorney's office in New Jersey as the first black lawyer, assistant United States District Attorney for the District of New Jersey in the criminal division when Dave Sachs was there, and prosecuted cases and stuff, and had the distinction of prosecuting a case with Ray Brown, one of the cases that defended against him, a espionage case, which at that time, which is 1965, lasted about 3 months, which was a long case at that time. And from there, went into the Essex County Prosecutor's Office as the second black lawyer in that office. And I was on my way to go into and set up my own practice and so on. And ran into this most persuasive lawyer, Dickinson Devereux. And Dick Devereux is a very, very intelligent but a very persuasive guy. Well, he and Alan Lowenstein and a couple of other guys came to me and said, well, we want you to, with this legal services process, what legal services to do what? Well, we're gonna want to set up legal services under the anti-poverty program and the like and so on. We want you to head this up. I said, now, what are we going to do with this? What did this legal service is supposed to do? It's supposed to represent poor people. I said, oh yeah? And you're going to have 8 lawyers. I said, oh, yeah? Well, 8 lawyers? You telling me I got 8 lawyers and I can do with them just about what I want to do with them? That 8 lawyers can produce some power. And I understood that lawyers, are one of the main architects of social change and the like and that kind of thing and so on. And by this time I had become an associate, if you will, or confidant of Dr. Martin Luther King. And I was co-counselor to the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and the like. And I said, okay. And legal services became the second legal services project in the country after the California Rural Assistance Legal Services Program out of California. And this was all kinds of turmoil was happening in Newark at the time. All kinds of things. There was a movement afoot by then Mayor Adonisio to appoint a fellow by the name of Callahan, I think his name was, if my memory strikes me correctly, and Bob can correct me if I'm wrong, Kirby, to make him secretary to the Board of Education. And this fellow didn't even have a high school education. And as against another fellow, Wilbur Parker, who was a certified public accountant and all this kind of thing with all kinds of degrees and the like, and all these things were raging. And I said, well, this can't be. So I had meetings with Norman Schiff, who was the corporation counsel at the time, and they had about 7 lawyers in the corporation counsel's office. So I said, well, Norman, I have 8 lawyers on my staff. I said, if we don't come to some kind of reasonable understanding here, I can tie up this whole city with these 8 lawyers that I have. And I will, if we don't come to some kind of reasonable accommodation. Well, that was one of the evidences and the reflections of the power that came through legal services, which incidentally legal services had not even been written into the Anti-Poverty Act in the first place. It was an afterthought. But when you give lawyers and you tell lawyers they can do all kinds of things to represent poor people, now you are empowering poor people with a voice and an advocacy that they never had before. And thousands of cases that we represented in terms of tenancy matters where landlords were doing all kinds of nefarious things in complicity with City Hall and that kind of thing. And you know how the situation goes. If you have the money and that kind of stuff and you talk to your favorite politician and you do this or that, you could do just about what you wanted to do, especially when you have poor and defenseless people as the tenants in your facility. Well, we sought to change all that, and I think we did a pretty good job of doing it. But aside from the mundane, the everyday type of activity that we engaged in, there's some significant things that we also involved in. One of the things was the medical school fight. And I was the director of legal services, and Junius was on my staff at the time. And we decided that we're going to take this on. Paul Ilversacker, who was a great guy, who was the commissioner of the Department of Community Affairs at the time and the like, and we took them on. The powers that be, and they said, well, we want to put this. They didn't really want to put the hospital in Newark in the first place, the university in Newark in the first place. But I recognized the fact that Martland Hospital over there on Bergen Street was a meat factory, and we needed to have a teaching hospital in Newark. That was necessary. But now we had all kind of competing political interests, because when they were talking about 180 acres, that's going to wipe out just about a whole lot of the Central Ward, and the black politicians in the Central Ward were not too tame to that idea. you're going to drive out all these people out of our ward and that kind of thing and so on. And that I don't know if we want this hospital. Well, I was one of the ones to say, okay, well, look, guys, and we had meetings in Louise Jefferson's basement, all of it, whatever have you. Bob was in a number of those meetings. Whatever. Okay, let's see what we can do to reduce this acreage down to a manageable level so that we get the hospital, you retain your political assemblage of people, and we move on with the situation. And to make a long story short, we fought that fight, and quite frankly, we won the fight. And to Newark's betterment and for the benefit of the city of Newark that still exists. That's one of the major accomplishments that legal services was able to put together and attain. Aside from that, I represented the cab driver, John Smith, whose arrest was one of the catalysts that ignited the civil disorders in Newark. I was in my office and I got a call that over at the 4th precinct they had brought this black fellow into the precinct, the police, in July. This is in 1967 now. And they had brought him in by his heels, dragging him his bloody and this and that and so on. And the people were incensed, and they were at the door of the precinct and the like, and threatening to do this and that and all kinds of things. And if my, again, memory serves me correctly, Bob was there, Kervin. So I go into the precinct and talk to the captain, talk to the captain and so forth, and say, look, we got to do something here. Now, legal services, I was stretching it, and I did it just the same, because legal services is supposed to be for civil things, not criminal defense. So I talked to my board members and the like, and I talked to, I call him Dick now, Denver Ward, the senior judge on retirement from the Federal District Court, one of the brightest judges ever been on that court. So I said, Dick, well, this is what the situation is, and I want to represent this guy. I think I should. Legal services, they called me to come over there, whatever happened. He says, well, can you find some way to find some civil aspect to it? I said, I can find something. To make a long story short, I went in the precinct there and talked to the captain, and there was a phalanx of police officers in front of the precinct. The people from the projects who had assembled there that had observed this untoward behavior on the part of the police. They were confronting each other, and epitaphs were being exchanged and all of that and so on. So we supposedly worked out a deal where the police would restrain, they would not attack the people and so forth and so on, and then I would get on top of a car with a bullhorn and seek to disperse these people that were there by redirecting their energies for a march down to City Hall, that kind of thing and so on. This is before the riots began. So I get on top of this car with a bullhorn. And I'm up there and I'm telling the people that I'm going to represent this John Smith with a name John Smith, no less. I said, I'm going to represent John Smith. He's okay. He didn't kill him and this and that and so forth and so on. While I'm doing that, the police officers, contrary to the agreement that had been struck, charged into the people. Any other story that you've been told is not true, because that's exactly what happened. And when that happened, well, the rocks and bottles started to fly, and I'm on top of this car. I said, oh, Lord, I had to get down off top of that car, whatever have you. The whole conflagration broke out. that's how the civil disorders or the riot, whatever way you want to call it, started in Newark. Now, talking about Tim Still, and who was a good friend of mine, and what happened after in civil disorders and legal services, again, participation. And as my introducer indicated, the governor had designated me as the representative between the various different community groups around the city. We convened a meeting in my apartment. I was living in the Colonnade Apartments on Clifton Avenue at that time. And I'm there, the Governor Hughes, Larry Bilder, who was his chief of staff, who subsequently became a Superior Court judge, myself, Ray Brown, another fellow, Duke Moore, George Richardson, a bunch of fellows. Well, Tim Still wasn't there, because he was under siege over there in Hayes Homes, and it was spraying the building over there with bullets, the state police and the like, and so on. And the governor says, well, look, I can have no meeting here without Tim Still. All right, well, how are we going to get Tim Still here? Okay. Well, I said, well, since Governor, at this time the riots had been going on for about 3 days. And riots, I've come to understand and to appreciate, don't last any longer than about 3 days. Now there were all kinds of tanks in the street, this and that, and so forth, and we're trying to get the governor to agree to pull the tanks back to a perimeter, because these National Guards, young fellas from various different suburban communities, were getting into all kinds of disputes with responsible black citizens who were not had anything to do with any riots. And this was about to get into a different kind of situation. Hughes, the Irishman, says, no, I'm not going to do that. No, line drawn in the sand. These people, they're lawless, and they got to be taught a lesson. All right. So now, I said, but meanwhile, we talking, 3 hours we there. So now, how are we going to go get Tim Still? I said, okay, I'll go get him. And Ray Brown says, okay, I'll go with him. And Ray Brown looks like a whole lot of the folk who are here. Very fair-skinned black person. And he's full-bird colonel in the National Guard. He's got his National Guard outfit on with the scrambled eggs on his cap. I said, Ray, you going with me, but you're not going with me looking like that. So I had to, and Ray was maybe 30 pounds heavier than me. So I said, you got to take that shirt. If you're going with me, you got to take that shirt off and take that scrambled egg cap off, because they're going to mistake you for the enemy. Okay, so that's what happened. He took that off and he put on one of my shirts with the buttons half popping off and so on, like the fellow in Smiling Jack, with the button coming off. And so we went over to Hayes Homes and got Tim Still out of the Hayes Homes and brought him back. So now we're talking again. Well, that didn't exactly do it with the government. Fortuitously, the telephone rings. My wife calls me in the bedroom. My daughter then was, about 4 months old. I go in the bedroom, and who's on the phone but my friend, Dr. Martin Luther King, who had performed my marriage ceremony and the like, and I was co-counsel to the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and the like. And he was just calling to find out how me and my wife were doing and so on. So I told him that the governor was there and what we were trying to accomplish and the like and so on. He said, oh, the governor's there, so on. And I said, what we trying to do? We're trying to get the governor to move these tanks back to a perimeter and the like. He said, would you like for me to give the governor some religion? I said, well, Martin, I would certainly appreciate it if we can't give him any religion. He won't do what we're trying to get him to do. I said, would you put the governor on the phone? So I go out and I said, well, Governor, it's a phone call. Who is it? I said, well, it's Dr. Martin Luther King. Dr. King, which was fortuitous, he did not expect that to happen. Goes in, he talks to Dr. King for, had to be no more than 15 minutes. About 15, 20 minutes. Came back out. Now, we've been there for about 4 hours. Within about 25 minutes, everything that we've been trying to get the governor to do, he did. And the riots, as some people say, were resolved in Newark. That's one of the highlights of what I think legal services was able to accomplish. One last thing. I mentioned about John Smith. Now, he was accused of having punched one white police officer in the stomach and punched another white police officer in the jaw. I defended him, criminally. Now, technically, I wasn't supposed to be doing that, but I did it. The jury came back with a compromise verdict. They found him guilty of hitting one fellow in the jaw, but not the other fellow in the stomach. Okay, so he's convicted. Meanwhile, I took an appeal. Went all the way up through the Third Circuit Court of Appeals, federal. Because my contention was that John Smith had not been convicted by a jury of his peers, and the grand jury selection process was flawed because they had only utilized the Rotary Club, the Lions Club, and the like. And how many minorities were members of those groups at the time? None. As it were, the whole indictment trial was thrown out for violation of John Smith's civil rights. Thereafter, the whole jury system, as a result of that case, was changed in the state of New Jersey. The way that grand juries are selected and the way pettit juries are selected was changed. It went to the voter registration list and the like. That is one of the singular highlight accomplishments of what happened through my tenure at the Newark Legal Services Project. Those things that I impart to you this evening. Thank you.
So I've been told that we have about 10 minutes time to do some Q&A. So any questions from anybody? Max, sorry.
Well, I was just curious about the relationship between, well, there are two questions actually. One of them is, I know you folks at the Legal Services Project took a lot of affidavits from people that were brutalized during that period, and nobody was ever indicted. And I always wanted to hear, your impression on that. The other thing I wanted to mention is Seal Aarons, who will be 104 years old in September. Going back to the UCC, I believe she was the secretary back then. So I'm curious about the relationship between African Americans and Jews, both in the UCC and in the legal services movement.
Well, let me say this. That's another of the singular accomplishments that I did not mention that I'm proud of in terms of broad gauge kind of things that legal services was able to accomplish. When I was
appointed by the governor to the Blue Ribbon Select Commission on Civil Disorders, I had the investigators from the Legal Services Project to gather affidavits from people all over the city where the civil disorders had taken place, and some of whom had taken pictures of windows being smashed and so on, and stores being shot up and the like. And it turned out, much to the chagrin of one of the governors, not Governor Minor, but Governor Driscoll, who was a strong supporter of the state police, that the state police had shot up these stores, had broken out these windows and the like, because those stores, the stores that had written on their windows in Soul Brother, those stores were spared by the rioters, or the persons who were committing these riotous acts. And the state police came along, and some of them having been being inhabited by persons of certain kinds of civil rights persuasion, negative persuasion, they decided, well, since those stores were spared, we're going to break out the windows and shoot up those stores. So all of that information was brought to the attention of the commission, which the commission addressed, and as I say, much to the chagrin of Governor Driscoll, who was a strong supporter before that of the state police and the like, and that how could this happen? Well, we had proof that it did happen, and it got into the commission's report, and there were certain reformations that were instituted by the state police and the like. Now, no one from the state police was ever prosecuted for those illegal acts for whatever reason, but there were certain institutional reforms that did take place.
Just a quick comment on the black-Jewish relationships. If any of you saw the film at the Newark Museum a few days ago about Rabbi Joachim Prince, I thought that was a really good reminder. He and Dr. King nationally promoting black-Jewish coalition work, but also here in Newark, he was instrumental in trying to bring the communities together. And also his son, Jonathan, was one of the vice presidents, I believe, of United Community Corporation. So he was really in the thick of starting the war on poverty here in Newark.
Dr. King was in Newark. Dinner at one of the hotels. I'm trying to think of which one it was. And he was to be introduced by Joachim Prince. And I never will forget his introduction. He said, "This night will go down in history. It's the first time a prince has ever introduced a king."
Preface my question to Mayor Gibson. Just point out that Mayor Gibson is still an activist. He was one of several people, including myself and the Newark Water Group, that were hauled into court for submitting an ordinance called can't think of the name, the Save Our Water ordinance. My question is, what is his opinion of activism? What is the state of activism today?
Not as good as I would like to see. There are still issues that people should be better informed and active in. The water issue was one very, very difficult to educate people on, primarily because most people in Newark don't even know that they own one of the most valuable resources in the country. 38,000 acres of land in the suburban areas Most people don't realize why we had so many breweries in Newark. We have one of the best water sources in this country. Those beer producers did not come to Newark because they loved Newark. They came because the water was the best. And I started this fight in 1968. Took my last little money out of the bank. I had a lawyer that sued Adonisio and the city. We were in court and we won the suit primarily because they made a political mistake. They were trying to transfer all the land and resources to this corporation by resolution. And they had to do it by ordinance. And the judge ruled in my favor. Lenny Wineglass was my lawyer. And he called me up, he said, "Ken, we won." I said, "What happened?" He said, "They made a stupid mistake." But that water issue still exists. And the people of the city of Newark own that most valuable resource. And we got a bad judge ruling that now makes the city responsible for paying for the dissolution of that group, when they said all the time they were private. But anyway, we don't have enough activity on things that are most important. I still think education is more important.
I think we have time for a couple more, sir.
This is not a question, but rather a comment. Tim Still's name was mentioned a couple of times. I just want to tell a cute story. I was working for the business community, and I don't remember the year it was. Tim was up at Hayes Homes and was conducting a program for kids in boxing. He was quite a community leader and had a boxing program at Hayes Homes, and he needed some equipment, so he contacted some folks, and I made arrangements with President of Bamberger's at the time, David Udich, to get him some of this boxing equipment. So we went over to Bam's to pick up the equipment. Well, it was really a sight. Tim picks up both, he was a huge man, and he picks up 2 punching bags. You know the size of a punching bag? He picks up 2 punching bags, puts them on his shoulders. I grab some gloves and some other things. And the sports department, I guess, was like the 5th or 6th floor. And we're coming down Bam's escalator. Tim was walking out. Everybody stopped. I mean, it was a sight. We walk out onto Market Street. He had somebody pick us up. It was just, but he was a wonderful man and just a real community leader. It was really a great contribution to the city that he made.
Thank you for that. Thank you. Ma'am?
Hi. I was actually a teenager in Newark during the War on Poverty, and in fact I remember being one of the teenagers who had summer jobs in the Head Start program, being in like the playgrounds. And certainly the whole thing to me at the time was in the context of the civil rights movement rather than the specifics of the charter movement. One thing that was brought up, which I thought was really interesting, that I'd like your take on, was when you talk about the the community agencies, the anti-poverty money becoming another source of power. Do you think that was subconscious? I mean, in general, if you look at the history of civil rights in this country, right, it's the federal government against local authorities to sort of impose some resources and some, federal power. So do you think that was sort of a conscious thing of that money was channeled not through City Hall, very purposely to create another center of power that was more African American after all? There was no black mayors then. It was, totally white. And I just also want to mention, I think the Other America, Michael Harrington, also was sort of the beginning of, that, there's a lot of people who are poor, right? And then that in the context of the civil rights movement and the more power thing. And I'm curious about your analysis of that.
Yeah, I think it was a conscious decision on the part of the federal government. Now, once the local politicians rallied, they were able to get Congress to beat back a lot of those gains. You know, there was Green Amendment and all kinds of things that kept local area boards and communities from registering people to vote, and there were all kinds of restrictions that eventually were put on the funding. So that it wasn't as free as it had started out to be. But that was a very conscious decision on their part to bypass City Hall. And I'm sure Newark was one of the very first organizations to get their funding through that.
I just want to add to that, though, that I don't think that the folks who caused the anti-poverty program, including Lyndon Johnson and whoever else, intended for the community action aspect of the anti-poverty program to come to do what they did. Because what happened, the community action aspect of the anti-poverty program was one of the best organizers for minority political participation that they did not anticipate, and mayors all over the country were complaining, what do you do? You allow this money to be given to this private agency that we have no control over. They're running candidates against us, they're doing this and they're doing that, they're doing all kind of political organizing and all of that. And I tell you that part of the reason why President Obama is president today as the precursor of the seeds that were sown by community action through and under the anti-poverty program.
Thank you. You might give Mayor Gibson the last
Mayor
word.
Gibson, do you have a final word?
The only thing I can add, and Oliver put it in, and Becky put it in context, is that community action was not as effective in some other cities as it was in Newark. Newark was a forerunner of that kind of action. We set, I think we wrote a map on some of that. It didn't happen in every city.
Thank you very much. Will you please thank our panelists one last time? Thank you all for coming, and please feel free to continue the conversation. Good night.
Thanks so much. Wow. Really, it's
Finished at 7:53 p.m.